Travel and Things, in association with Rugged Wear, Real People, Real Clothing, Real Solutions, presents In Conversation With. I am your host, David Batsoffen, and today I have not one, but two guests, George and Margo Branch. Good morning and welcome to you both.
Good morning. Lovely to be with you.
Yeah. Thank you so much for joining. Where do I find you this morning?
You find us sitting at home in an upstairs office, and as you can see, there's all the paraphernalia of science dotted around us in our room.
Thank you. But you go. Why pick the Cape Coast? I mean, the water there is cold for marine biologists.
No, the water here is brilliant. It's the meeting point of two of the most contrasting currents in the world. What better place for a marine biologist?
But it's cold, George.
No, I don't believe it. I think it's fantastic. It's perfect.
Everywhere else is too hot, so we go and cool off there.
Fair enough. Now, the reason I'm chatting to you is I found not one, but two of your books, this being one, Two Oceans, and Living Shores, if I can get my hand out of the way, while I was on holiday down on the Natal North Coast. My wife loved this book. She really did. And she said to me, had she but seen this book when she left school, she would have become a marine biologist and not a doctor, is what she turned out to be. And I just loved this one. In fact, I used it as a reference for something that I wrote, with all credit given, Professor. Those little ghost crabs are most fascinating. The pink ghost crabs that sit and wait for the turtle hatchlings. So talk to me about your careers. You know, what got you started in marine biology? Margo, let's start with you. Ladies first.
Well, I started in Zim, and we used to come down on holiday to the Transkei.
Okay.
And it was the most wonderful adventure, and I had an aunt there who was very keen on all the things that on the shore, so she really inspired me.
Because I was going to say, become a marine biologist in Zim must be a bit of an oxymoron, because the nearest sea is like Maputo.
Yeah, it was when we came to university in Cape Town that we really got going, but the seeds had been sown in childhood.
Fair enough. And George, for yourself?
Well, actually, my path is very parallel to Margo's. I also came down on holiday as a very young person, and I was intrigued by the marine life, and I collected some specimens and had the nerve to take them to the South African Museum and ask the expert what they were.
Mm-hmm.
And he, at first, he treated them with some boredom because he'd seen them all before. And then suddenly his eyes lit up and he said, "Oh, my word, this sea spider, that's never been recorded in South Africa before. This is a new record." So I thought, wow, if at the age of whatever I was, about 9, I can find a new record, there must be some future for me in marine science. So that was the beginning.
But now with that, I know that I haven't been quite just with you, because your academic accolades almost defy description. So I should have started off by calling you Professor, not just going, "Hello, George Branch" type of thing.
Even the staff and the students at the university, I was just George.
Wasn't there a Gerald Durrell book called Just George?
No,
there was
I don't think so.
There's
a monkey called Just George.
Okay.
Maybe Margo can tell you. When I was at a big international conference,
mm-hmm.
I was presented this bucket in recognition of Just George the monkey. Curious George.
Curious George. Wonderful, wonderful.
Curious George.
Going back to school, George, did you know, in fact, this question is for both of you, and you can answer it in whatever order you wish. Did both of you know that this was the path that you were going to follow? Or if I'd spoken to either of you, an 18-year-old version of either of you, would you have thought you would have chosen something different?
Well, let me answer first, and then Margo can chip in. There was no doubt in my mind that I was going to be a biologist.
Right.
But it was only after I arrived in Cape Town and started exploring the marine world in a more scientific kind of way that I fell in love with the sea. So the marine part of marine biologists came later, but I was always encouraged by my family. I had a big butterfly collection, and biology was always very part of my life. I was often out in the veld as much as I could be in those days up in Zimbabwe. And Margo can add her own perspective.
Yes, I also started with the insects in Zimbabwe. I had a collection, and at 13 I had a science collection that was in the newspaper.
Oh, wow.
But I was quite inspired by Scaife. You know, we had a series of paid little notelets that we used at junior school, actually, with lovely illustrations in it. And I've always enjoyed drawing.
Okay.
And at the age of about 11, I decided I wanted to write a book and use line drawings in it. And so it sort of opened up the idea. When I got to Cape Town, also with a strong marine focus, that was how we ended up in that direction.
I might add that Margo's artistry and her artwork have featured in all sorts of books and scientific publications, apart from those that we've done ourselves.
Oh, wonderful. Much like the Roberts birds, where they used, in the olden days, they used hand-drawn plates rather than photographs.
Yes.
Yes.
So let's start with this particular book, Two Oceans. Now, I know as a wildlife photographer, it's relatively easy to take pictures of wildlife because they're either there or they're not, or you'll find them at a later time. But, you know, for you guys, trying to take pictures of sea creatures can't be easy.
Yeah, that is actually very, very true. We used every single trick in the trade in terms of photography to get those photographs. Some of them are taken underwater with underwater cameras.
Right.
Others, we've brought them back to the house and put them in tanks and let them settle down naturally and behave naturally. And then we photograph them in tanks. Others are photographed through a microscope. Some photographs were taken from a helicopter to get whale pictures. A lot are taken in the open air with telephoto lenses. So we used the full gamut of different techniques available to us to get these photographs.
The seaweeds are particularly difficult to photograph well. And there you have to light them from behind to get the light shining through the seaweed and put them in a tank and try and get them to show the features in an attractive way.
Because I think what people don't realize, and again, if you sort of compare it to wildlife photography, is that the lighting underwater is totally different to lighting on land.
Yeah, that's correct. Unless you use a flash underwater, you don't get true colors because the water filters out different lights and different colors. And so you get a very artificial looking picture unless you use a flash that generates the true spectrum of light.
Now, if I look back to this particular book, where it's just the two of you that authored this one, is this a more scientific work of the two books?
They're quite different in their nature. You know, what this book does is to describe the ecology and the management issues that face us on the shore. So, you know, if you really want to learn about how the sea works around our shores and how we manage those systems, this is the book for you. So this is a book where you really dig deep and you can experience the full gamut. It's like getting a 3-year university course condensed in one book.
If I read this book cover to cover and I answer questions set by you, could I then ask for university certification at the end of it?
No, you'd have to pay for 3 years tuition first.
They are offering a marine biology course at matric level, and those students are using the book quite a bit as well.
That's wonderful.
So recently, in the last couple of years, they've introduced the course at matric level.
Yeah, there's a new course on marine sciences that's been introduced as a marine, as a matric subject.
Okay, because I was watching on one of the news channels recently, a group of people that were setting up, it seemed to be, I came in late, so I'm not too sure, somewhere in Greece, a marine sanctuary. And they thought they were in a pristine environment. Turns out there's plenty of plastic and metal underwater. But what was of interest to me was they were opening fish. They were doing research on fish in the area, and they were finding so much microplastic. The one tiny little minnow had something like 85 pieces of microplastic inside it. You know, we seem to be worried about carbon footprint, and maybe plastics is what we should really be worrying about.
Well, I think there are a number of things we need to worry about. But to be honest, we prefer to focus on the glories of our seashore rather than the issues, because we still have much to be thankful on our seashores.
And I always think that people are more likely to protect the ocean life if they love it than if they feel anxious. And, you know, I've been to the beach with people who are into pollution, and they walk along picking up the plastic, and they don't notice all the other lovely things that are on the beach.
I hear
we
what you're saying.
Plastic, but we look at all the other lovely things as well.
Yeah, no, I hear exactly what you're saying. Now, you very kindly sent me some images, and why not let's talk to them or talk about them. George, you and I seem to have something in common. You put water and a sunrise together with some nice clouds, and bang, thank you very much. This is one of the things that I like doing, getting up early in the morning.
Yes, indeed. My grandson recently wrote an essay on Grandpa. And in that essay, he said, he's a little mad. He gets up at the crack of sparrow's fart to go and take sunrise photographs.
Yeah, I just get irked when you look and you see what time sunrise is going to be, and they tell you, and then it's not, or there's too much cloud cover, so you sit in the freezing cold waiting for some beautiful images, and you go back to have a cup of coffee because it's just not worth it. But again, any sunrise is worth its weight in gold. It really and truly is. Where was this image taken?
This particular image was taken at Betty's Bay.
Okay.
You can see the rocks in the background there that line the coast, but in front of it there was a magnificent pool that was reflecting this lovely image. So as you got the image of the sun in the top there,
yeah,
it also reflected completely in the background. And I just loved the way the early morning rays were just catching everything.
Now, I won't ask you to count how many birds are in this particular picture, or ask you, Margo, where's Wally? Because it looks like somewhere in there should be a guy in a red striped shirt and a hat hiding. Who wants to answer what this is about and where it was taken?
Maybe I should answer this one. And this was taken at Bird Island on the west coast, where there was a huge colony of gannets. And I love this photograph because it symbolizes the idea that birds have huge effects on rocky shores around islands. You know, you can think of the obvious things like oyster catchers being predators on islands where they're concentrated because it's protected. But don't forget the fact that when these bird colonies form, they produce huge amounts of guano. And that guano leaches off the island into the surrounding waters and fertilizes the shores. So growth rate of everything there is hugely enhanced. The seaweeds grow fast, the limpets grow larger than they normally would grow, and so on. So there's a whole ecosystem effect of birds on the shores around islands.
Now, George, you said that there was a colony. Is it no longer?
There still is a colony, but it's much reduced now. And the reason is quite interesting. Two things took place. One was that some of what we call rogue seals turned to preying directly on the adults on the island.
You can see the seals in the back right hand, silhouetted in the back.
There.
Yes, right up there you can see them. And normally they've never been much of a nuisance, but just a few individuals started preying on it, and the island was abandoned for almost 2 years by the gunners. But now they've managed to control those seals, and the birds have returned. But on top of that, a remarkable thing happened, and that was that the main prey items, the anchovy and the sardines, have shifted their distribution. They used to be predominantly West Coast, and then for a long period of time in the early 2000s, they shifted their center of distribution onto the South Coast. And the result was that these birds were now more intensely in competition with fishing, and they suffered from a food shortage. And lots of them bailed out of the island and moved to another bird island, which is just off Port Elizabeth. But there still is a colony here, and it's still the most wonderful place to go and visit, because they have a hide on the island where you can sit, where they can't see you, but you can see them at close distance. It's a great place to visit, Lambert's Bay.
Okay. Just as a matter of interest, while I'm thinking about it, in either book, are there any species that you missed out on for whatever reason, or something that you'd wish you had included in the books, but forgot or just didn't have the opportunity to do so?
You know, it's impossible in a book like this to cover every single marine species. You know, there are entire massive books written about all the fish. So we had to be selective. And what we've done is to cover the species that we feel the average person is most likely to find or to catch.
Okay.
And so we cover almost 2,500 different species in the book. But there are many that had to be left out as a result. But whenever we find something new or get a brand new photograph, or we feel, gee, that should be in the book, we add it to the next edition.
Fair enough. Now, this particular image fascinated me because it took me a while to figure out what was going on here, because when I received your pictures and the blurb that you sent with it, I couldn't find this photograph. And then I took a closer look at this, and then I realized what I was looking at. So 2,000 lobsters gone in a flash? Who wants to answer?
Yeah, this is a remarkable story, actually. I had a student who came from Israel, Amos Barkai, and I set him to looking at the life that occurs around the islands in Saldanha Bay. And when first he dived, he said to me, you know, it's incredibly different between the two islands. The one island has masses of lobsters, and they seem to eat most other forms of animal life there. So what grows there is quite different from the other island. And he couldn't figure out, now, why is the other island so different? There were no lobsters there. And so he did a remarkable series of experiments. And one of them was to introduce lobsters from the island where they are abundant onto the other island. And we were curious to see whether this would change the system. But what happened absolutely astounded us, because as fast as he released the lobsters, the first time he did it was just 50 lobsters. And we found that the lobsters became almost immediately overwhelmed by these little whelks. And if you look closely at the photograph, you'll see that the whelks are covered with a purple incrustation. And that purple coloring is actually a different kind of creature. We call them sea mosses. And this particular sea moss is highly toxic. And so it protects these whelks from predation by anything like lobsters.
Wow.
And so we have what we call in a scientific way, we refer to this as a reversal of states, an alternative stable state, where two different conditions can exist for prolonged periods, one dominated by lobsters, but the other one dominated by the whelks. And as fast as you add lobsters, they get charred. And as you quite rightly said, the first time he did it, I said, I don't believe the story. I think you must have injured the animals before you introduced them, and they were weak. And So he said, all right, I'll do it again. And he did a much bigger experiment. You'd never get away with nowadays that there are so few lobsters left. And he introduced 2,000 lobsters. And he was very careful about not harming them or injuring them. And exactly the same thing happened. It was an astonishing and quite gruesome thing to observe.
I shouldn't be laughing. I mean, the lobsters were probably going, no, here he comes again, we're going to die. But who would have thought that something as small as a whelk was possible to take on something like a lobster and win? But 2,000 of them sound almost excessive.
Yeah, well, as you can see here, it's a numbers game.
Yeah, for sure.
One whelk would not be able to do anything to the lobster.
No.
It would be able to skip away almost immediately. But when you have densities, we were recording densities of up to 200 per square meter.
Wow,
that's a lot of whelks.
That's a lot of whelks. Now, talking about a lot of whelks, these are a lot of blue bottles. I don't want to be on this beach when these things wash up in these numbers.
Yes, we were alerted by somebody that there'd been a huge blue bottle wash up at Hart Bay, and we went across there, and it was a most amazing experience because we found all sorts of other wonderful creatures that float along with the blue bottles and that feed on the blue bottles. And if you go on to the next picture.
We'll get there in a moment. Have you any idea how many blue bottles were washed up? I mean, this looks like...
Well, it was about a meter. It was about a meter deep.
Wow.
And, the whole beach, it was quite amazing, really.
Just as a matter of interest, Margo, how long do blue bottles remain venomous when they're out of the water? Because, I always step very carefully around these things because, like most children brought up on a beach in Port Elizabeth, I've been stung more than once by these things, and it's not pleasant.
No, when we were on holiday, we used to walk along and pop them, with our heels.
Yes.
And then one got up and stung me, and boy, that was hectic. They do remain, as long as they sort of blue, they probably will remain stinging.
Okay.
They need to remain moist for the discharge to be able to take place.
Okay.
But they'll retain enough discharge capacity for at least 3 or 4 hours lying on the beach.
The thing is to wash them off with salt water, not with fresh water, because the fresh water makes the stinging cells swell and actually discharge.
Okay.
So it makes even more stings.
Yeah, there are other ways to get rid of this thing, which we won't go into now. It becomes a little personal. I think we've all peed on somebody on a beach in order to alleviate their pain. You were talking, I take it this is the image that you're referring to, Margo.
Yes.
Yes, indeed.
Is this two separate?
Whenever we see the blue bottles come in, we always look for these other creatures.
We call them the blues collectively because they all share this lovely blue color.
So are these two separate creatures?
Yes, yes.
Yeah,
Okay,
they
so
are indeed. The one on the left is a close relative of the blue bottle. We call it the blue button. And you can see it also has a float, but it looks like a circular raft.
Yeah.
And then it has long tentacles that hang down underneath and surround that float.
Okay.
But the interesting part of this story is the animal on the right. It's called a sea swallow.
It's beautiful.
And it's actually one of the nudibranchs, which is a whole group of mollusks, just like the snails and the limpets. But the nudibranchs have abandoned their shells. And to compensate for that, they develop toxic properties in various ways. And one of the tricks of the trades that they have is that they eat blue bottles. And when they do, they capture the stinging cells from the blue bottles and they build those into their own tissues so that they themselves possess stinging cells, secondhand stinging cells.
So if you walk along the beach and you find these little things, they usually just look like a little blue blob. And the secret is to float them in some water and they open up and they really are beautiful. They're only about 1.5 centimeters long. So they're quite small, but they're well worth keeping an eye open for.
Yeah, they're stunning animals.
Just what you were saying about being able to absorb toxins from another species, and we as humans think we're top of the food chain. We have no idea, absolutely none, as to how to do something like that. We get that. If you were to say to somebody, where is east or where is south, they probably wouldn't. East is because of the sun, they know east and west. But north and south, I think people could mess up quite easily. We're useless. We really and truly are.
Yeah.
And this was you were referring, George, to a float. I take it this is what, or a raft. This is what you were referring to.
Yeah, this is another common little creature that washes up with the blues. And it's a whelk that feeds, it floats along and feeds on the blue bottles. But we were quite excited when we found this one, because not only has it got its raft of bubbles that it creates itself, but attached to the raft are the pink eggs. Below the raft are a whole lot of pink eggs, and we'd never seen that before. So we were quite excited to get not only the whelk, but its raft and its pink eggs.
How
the
long do
whelks
the
are
eggs?
interesting because a lot of the other mollusks just shed their sperm and their eggs into the water and take potluck for fertilization, but the whelks actually create these little egg sacs, and the eggs are nurtured in a little egg case so that they are more likely to be floating next to the blue bottles, which are their food when they hatch.
Wow, okay.
There's actually an interesting sideline story. Each of those pink capsules, in many of the whelks, you will have more than one egg developing inside that capsule. But the first egg that hatches and develops into a larva then turns cannibalistic and eats all the other eggs and all the later larvae. So it gets a kickstart in life.
You know, when you say that, I was thinking about, we've just come back, as I said, from the North Coast, and we went down specifically to see if we could find hatchlings and turtle hatchlings, and we found one. I think he was the runt of the litter because we found tracks of about 30, and he was the only one still on the beach. But what I think a lot of people forget is the fact that hatchlings are born orphans because their parents have left them. And these poor little critters have to just defend for themselves. They have to learn from immediately how to deal with life. Can you imagine human babies doing that? Being popped out,
Yeah, you're quite right.
You know, they wouldn't survive. Or there was another guest at the hotel who had a 5-month-old baby, and I said, the child wasn't walking yet. And I said, could you imagine if you had a wildebeest baby? Those things can run at 15 minutes. So not only would you have to be chasing the thing from the delivery room, you'd have to be chasing it up and down the house as well. Again, it brings me back to my point. Humans have no idea. How long does it take for babies to walk? About a year. And then 18 years to leave home. It's not fair.
With some people, it's much more than 18 years.
Yes, indeed. Now, these are false killer whales. These are not the real deal. So where do they fit into the oceanic hierarchy?
Well, they are one of a large number of different species of whales and dolphins, and even one porpoise that occurs around our coastline. And this particular episode, it recalls that terrible episode at Komiki where a large number of killer whales, false killer whales, stranded themselves on the shore. And there were desperate efforts made to try and save them, to get them back into the water and to release them. Huge numbers of volunteers just turned up more or less spontaneously to help to try and achieve this. Whenever I do this, I always feel proud of my students because there are a whole bunch of the zoology department students in this particular photograph rescuing these whales. Some of them were rescued, but unfortunately, most of them, as they were released into the sea, turned around and swam straight back to the shore, possibly stimulated by the distress calls of the other animals that were still stranded there. It was a horrible event, and eventually the poor fisheries manager had to come down and actually kill the whales because they clearly were not going to survive. But at least some of them were rescued in this attempt.
Do scientists?
Was when
Sorry, Margo.
another batch came in a few years later, and they treated these in a different way. They quickly collected them and transported them across to the other shore and released them. You know, they transported them by truck across to the west coast and to the east coast and released them there. And they had a greater success rate than trying to swim them back out on the side where they'd come in.
Are scientists aware what causes these mass whale strandings? I mean, there have been lots of theories proposed, but has anything definite been discovered?
Nobody's absolutely certain. I mean, of the theories, one popular theory is it's caused by seismic shocks caused by military explosions. But as far as is known, all of the mass strandings that we have had have not been associated at all with that kind of activity. So I don't think we can blame that activity in this particular case. Another theory is that animals become diseased and they get parasites in their ears that disorient them. That would work well for individuals being stranded, and it in fact does take place, but it would not explain mass strandings. Most people nowadays think that it has something to do with the nature of the actual sandy shores, because this particular place has now been the subject of 4 different mass strandings. So you do start to wonder, how come that particular place? And it has a very gentle shore, and we think that the whales get confused because they're not getting a regular bounce back recording that they can say, oh, we realize that there's a shore there. Okay. We think that their signals reflect off, and once one is stranded, its cries of distress attract the others, particularly if it's the dominant individual that gets stranded.
Now, from something as large as a whale to something as teeny tiny as this, these creatures fascinate me. I first came upon them at the Two Oceans Aquarium. They've got some in a tank there, but I'm hoping you're going to fill me in on their backstory and what makes them so important in the marine ecosystems.
Well, I'm particularly attached to this photograph because for a while, this particular species was actually named after me. It was Charybdis branchi. Unfortunately, some taxonomist has come along and decided, no, it actually should have a previous name.
No.
So I've lost my intimate association with this species.
I think there should be a petition, George. Bring back brunch.
I've got other things, both Margo and I have other things named after us, but this one was a rather gorgeous one. I have another rather intimate association with this animal, and that is that once when I was out snorkeling, taking underwater photographs, I had one of these animals wrap its tentacles around my chest. And it was the most brutal experience. I literally thought I was going to die. My heart went into palpitation and then ceased. And I can remember sitting there remarkably calmly in the water, thinking 1, 2, 3, and counting 23 seconds before the next heartbeat kicked in again. I thought, this is it. Well, it would have been a grand way for a marine biologist to go, but I did survive anyway.
Especially being stung by something that bears your name.
Well, the name came afterwards.
Who would have thought that something this tiny is capable of doing something like that to a human being, George?
Yeah, I think I was very unlucky. Other people have been stung and not suffered nearly so badly, but this one, it has very long tentacles, 4 tentacles. They call them the Cubo meduzi because they're cube-shaped with these tentacles. And the other thing that's interesting about this, if you look at the base of the tentacles, you can see little dark blobs, and those are the eyes of those meduzi. for a long time, people thought these relatively unsophisticated little creatures could never have eyes, but these ones have remarkably sophisticated eyes.
People don't realize that these sort of sea creatures, even though they may not have a brain per se, are able to exist without it. I mean, we know that some politicians don't seem to have brains and they seem to exist without them, but generally humans are meant to have them. But these are able to, without ears, without brains, without eyes in some cases, yet they go about their business and don't even worry about it.
Yeah, most invertebrates do have a brain. A brain is simply a concentration of nerve cells in a particular part of the body, which is usually in the head to coordinate activities. But you're quite right in saying that things like jellyfish don't have a centralized brain, and yet they are quite capable of strongly oriented movements and quite sophisticated behaviors.
Everybody's favorite, flamingos. The last time I saw a colony of any size was just outside Kimberley. There was a body of water there. And if you did Rovos Rail, they actually stopped the train there so that you could take photographs rather than just zip on by. Is it still there? Do the birds still frequent it?
There are birds there, but they're relatively small numbers. The dam hasn't been very well managed in recent years in terms of looking after the flamingos, and their numbers have depleted, but as far as I know, they are still there.
Okay. Now, you sent me 2 images of flamingos. This was the other one.
That's correct.
This is such a cool picture because you've got upright, you've got halfway, and then you've got head stuck in the water. I think this is a fabulous, whoever took this, kudos to you.
Yeah, the first photograph was of the lesser flamingo, which has a dark bill. In this photograph here, you can see how that's a sort of a dark, almost maroon uniform colored bill.
Yeah.
Whereas the second photograph is the greater flamingo, and they feed in completely different ways. I wanted to show this photograph because a student of mine did a wonderful piece of work up near Walvis and Sandwich Bay. His name was Dave Blassom. And all he did was to create little fences, which just consisted of 4 poles with rope strung between them. And it was sufficient to stop the flamingos from feeding in those 10 by 10 meter patches.
Mm-hmm.
And it was absolutely astonishing what happened, because the entire community of life growing in the mud there was absolutely transformed. In the absence of flamingo feeding, it was taken over by just one species of tiny little crustacean, which then formed a dense bed of tubes and completely dominated the life there. And everything from the macroscopic life through to what we call the myofauna, less than a millimeter, and even the nature of the bacteria were changed in the absence of the flamingos. So the flamingos are responsible for maintaining a high diversity, patchy kind of system compared to this uniform domination by a single species.
Now, I know we're talking all things marine today. We've been discussing your Two Oceans book, A Guide to the Marine Life of Southern Africa. It's by yourself, Charles Griffiths, Margo, and Lenaith Beckley. It's published by Struik Nature, and also Living Shores, Interaction with Southern Africa's Marine Ecosystems, by both yourself, George, and by Margo. And that too is published by Struik Nature. So it's all things marine. And then you come up with this image that I never expected to see.
Yes, I really wanted to include this because it included one of the most extraordinary moments in my field working life. I should add that in addition to the 2 books you've mentioned, Margo has also written a junior version of Living Shores called Explore the Seashore, which is for the young at heart between ages of about 7 and 70.
And is that also Struik Nature?
Yes. That's also done with Struik Nature, that's correct.
All right,
To
so
swing back to this photograph,
please.
it was taken on a field trip, an amazing field trip, which covered the whole of the Namibian coastline. It was a remarkable experience. But up north, when you're in a sanctuary area that relatively few people can go to, you really are in the wilderness up there. And I used to sleep out in the open in my sleeping bag every day if the weather permitted. And on this particular night, I was out sleeping and I heard an electrifying scream. It sounded a little bit like a sheep baaing.
Mm.
And I realized almost immediately that it must be one of the seal pups from the local colony that had been attacked. Now, I didn't know what was going on. It was still pitch dark, but I leapt out of my sleeping bag and grabbed my camera and cranked it up to the maximum speed possible and got this remarkable photograph. It's remarkable in a number of respects because the brown hyena there is normally very shy and hard to see.
Mm.
But this one wasn't going to move away from his kill and say, let us get the most gorgeous photographs. And then the most amazing thing was that he actually shared that meal with a jackal. And one of the people with us leading the tour was the ex-game ranger in charge of that area, the Skeleton Coast National Park. And he had lived there for 30 years. And he said, you know, I've never, ever seen anything this in my entire life. And I wanted to end like this because, you know, for both Margo and I, we've been privileged to have the most extraordinary experiences along the shoreline. We've covered the coast all the way from Angola to central Mozambique, and we've had some grand times. To be paid to do what you love doing in life is a rare privilege.
It is indeed. So what lies ahead for both of you?
Well, we're busy working on, and perhaps Margo should carry on here. We're busy working on a revision of the second half of our book, Living Shores. You know, when we redid the book that you've just been talking about, what we did was take the first half of the old Living Shores,
right,
and rewrite it completely. So this book is really a brand new book. It doesn't resemble the old one in any respect.
Okay.
But so much new had been discovered that we realized we couldn't cover it all in one book. And so we left out of it the section of the old book that dealt with all the different forms of marine life. And now we're busy working on that as perhaps our final swan song.
The second half will unpack how the animals work, you know, how a bird flies and the eyes of a crab and things like that, the interesting, intricate workings of them, not just because there's so many field guide type of books where you see the animal, you identify it and you learn a little bit about it.
Yeah.
But when you compare things like starfish with fish, and you see how different the structure of the animals is and how they function, it opens up a whole new fascinating topic.
Now, if people, sorry, say that again. I spoke over you.
You can see the microscope in the back there.
Yes.
And I love the microscope because it does open up a whole new world when you can see the details of some of these creatures.
True enough. We forget that there is microscopic life out in the water. It's not in the wild if you're a wildlife photographer, because what you see is what you get, unless they're teeny tiny mosquitoes or something like that, mites. But in water, there is all sorts of stuff that we are unable to see with our naked eye. If people have watched this and gone, well, we'd like to own copies of this book, how do they go about getting them? Are they available in bookstores, or do you have to go online? How does it work?
They're available in different ways. Bookstores are stocking the books, or you can order them direct from the publishers, and there are electronic versions of both books that can be obtained from the publishers. But we ourselves also sell the books, and we're in a privileged position where we can offer a discount. But of course, the problem is getting the books to the people. So if you're in Cape Town and you're accessible and you can get a book from us, you're always welcome to approach us directly to get books from us. And they come signed for a small fee.
For a small fee. If I hold your book to my camera, can you sign it electronically?
You wouldn't want that signature.
You know, this is the only
You haven't
problem.
paid the fee, so I can't.
I EFT'd it to you at the beginning of this talk, George. Check your bank statement. You alluded to an e-version. I have to say that I much prefer having a physical copy in my hands to having an electronic
But
version.
both of us would share that exact feeling. We love our books, and our house is filled with books. And
well, this is it.
real books are very special.
And I
A
think
home
you
without
browse
books
it
is not a home, it's
with
just a house. Yeah.
Yes.
George, Margo, thank you so very, very much for giving of your time. I've dragged you away from your microscope, Margo. I have no idea what I've dragged George away from. I'm scared to ask. But thank you so much. Thank you so much for your time this morning. It's been glorious talking to you. And thank you for sharing your images with both myself and my viewers. Two Oceans, a guide to the marine life of Southern Africa. As I said earlier, this is the 4th edition. I think people should go back to the first edition. You should have the entire range. Otherwise, it's not worth anything as a collector's item. It's published by Struik Nature, and it's written or co-authored, should I say that, by George and Margo Branch, Charles Griffith, and Lenath Beckley. And then the other one, which is a great book for a different reason altogether, interacting with Southern Africa's marine ecosystems, and that's by George and Margo Branch, also published by Struik Nature. Once again, thank you so much for joining me. It's been an absolute
You're very welcome, David.
Talking to the two of you, and I wish you all the best with your next project.
Yeah,
good, great.
Bye for now.
Thank you very much. Then
goodbye.
Bye bye.